him every blessing, and through the seed, all the blessings of God are released. So God chose Mount Moriah as the place where Isaac, as it were, would die and rise from the dead, as a picture of Christ. Now, how can we know what is the true Mount Moriah? The Jews have no doubt that it's the Temple Mount, and they're right. In 2 Samuel 24:16, the angel of judgment stood by the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite on the higher ground above the original city of David. He was ready to destroy Jerusalem. God told David to buy this threshing floor and build an altar there where he was to make atoning sacrifices to turn God's judgment away from Israel. When David saw that the Lord answered him on this threshing floor, he continued to sacrifice there. And soon after, Solomon built the temple on this very same ground that God had revealed to David as being the holy place for sacrifice. 2 Chronicles 3:1 says, Solomon began to build the house of the Lord at Jerusalem on Mount Moriah, where the Lord had appeared to his father David, at the place that David had prepared on the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite. Notice that the mount where the temple is built is Mount Moriah, the very same mount where Abraham offered up Isaac. And so, if the Bible's to be trusted, Mount Moriah, where the Lord promised to provide the ultimate sacrifice, is the very same mount where the temple was built. And both Abraham and David were shown this holy mount by divine revelation as the place ordained for sacrifice, set apart. And that's why the temple had to be built there, for the sacrifices, as the outworkings of the founding sacrifice and prophetic anticipations of the ultimate sacrifice that would end all sacrifices. Any sacrifice made anywhere else had no validity, and therefore God set aside this specific mount as the only place where the final atoning sacrifice could be made, if it was to be valid in the sight of God. And so the Old Testament requires that the Messiah had to die on Mount Moriah's peak, which is to the north. This is confirmed by a reference in Leviticus 1, that all the temple sacrifices had to be killed north of the altar. Verse 11, he shall kill it on the north side of the altar before the Lord. Why would God insist on this specification unless it had some prophetic significance? If sacrificial animals whose death symbolized Christ were slain to the north of the temple altar, surely it indicates that the ultimate sacrifice would be killed north of the temple. In the 19th century, many Bible students became increasingly aware that the traditional location of Christ's death and resurrection from the time of Constantine in the 4th century, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, did not agree with the Scriptures. For example, it seemed to be well within the city walls, whereas Christ was crucified and buried outside the walls. Moreover, it was to the west rather than to the north of the temple. Most importantly, it was not even on Mount Moriah, as Genesis requires. Tradition can be fine, but if it contradicts the word of God, we must discard it. Didn't Jesus say the traditions of men nullify the word of God? These Bible students searched for an alternative location, one that agreed with all the clues in the Bible. And indeed, they found it, just north of the city walls, northeast of the Damascus Gate. There is a rocky escarpment facing the city walls, which was already associated in local tradition with Jeremiah's grotto, the place where the prophet composed his lamentations over the destruction of Jerusalem. And let me read a verse from Lamentations 1:12. It says, "Is it nothing to you, all you who pass by?" You see, it's right next to a major road. "Behold and see if there be any sorrow like unto my sorrow, which has been brought on me, which the Lord has inflicted in the day of his fierce anger." This has to be the words of Christ. And Jeremiah wrote these prophetic words as a type of Christ. How fitting it would be if he wrote these words from the very same location that Jesus Christ would fulfill them 600 years later. The most famous of these early investigators was General Gordon, the notable British soldier who spent 11 months in Jerusalem in 1883. He noticed that the face of the cliff opposite the city wall resembled a skull, and he became convinced that the skull face was a biblical Golgotha. Although he was far from being the first to make this identification, the endorsement of this site by one of the most famous Christians of his day gave it widespread publicity. That's why it came to be known as Gordon's Calvary. Some of the features of this hill caused it to have a striking resemblance to a human skull. The first to identify it that we know was a German, Otto Thenius, in 1842, and from that time it became known as Skull Hill. And this agrees with the Bible description of where Jesus was crucified. John 19:17 says that Jesus bore his cross out to a place called the place of the skull. In Hebrew, it's Golgotha. Likewise, Luke 23:33 says they went to the place called the skull, where they crucified him. Matthew 27:33 and Mark 15:22 again says the same thing. He was crucified at the place of a skull. And so this was clearly a well-known location in the time of Christ. Not the place of skulls, but the place of a specific skull, due to the fact that it was an execution ground eerily overlooked by a skull in the rock face. It was associated with the skull, and here in the rock face, unique in all the cities of the world, is a skull with a brow and depressions for the eyes, nose and mouth. Although the mouth has now been covered by tarmac, you can see it in the earlier photos. The top of the knoll is rounded and dome-like and is 110 feet higher than the sacred rock of the temple. The term Golgotha or skull also implies this place was the head or crown of a hill. So this rounded hill with skull features at the summit of Mount Moriah perfectly fits the biblical description of the place where Jesus died. From Golgotha, you can look down on the Temple Mount in the south, further down Mount Moriah, where the animal sacrifices were made. From the side, you can see a perfectly formed nose. Photographs of the hill taken 150 years ago show the face of the skull is identical with its appearance today. No further erosion has taken place because of the hardness of the rock. And so, it's reasonable to suppose it had the same skull-like appearance in the time of Christ. This rocky precipice is about 50 feet high, 500 feet from the city wall. And one of the things clearly in its favor was that it was outside the city wall as required by the Bible. John 19:20 says the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city. And Hebrews 13:11 to 13 says the bodies of those animals whose blood is brought into the sanctuary